Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for joining us this morning at the Jerusalem Post Diplomatic Conference. Huge events are currently taking place at dizzying pace, transforming the country, the region, and now, as we see after the attacks in Paris, the world. Your plate as the country's Prime Minister is brimming over, even more so than usual. As agreed, our conversation will focus largely on the diplomatic issues, and since your time this morning is very limited, let's just delve in. The world has been shocked and horrified by the attacks in France. What are the operative steps that you recommend be taken now by the West to deal with the jihadist radicals? Is it time for the West to put boots on the ground, to commit troops? And what role does Israel have to play in this war?
First, we have to understand what is terrorism. Terrorism is the deliberate and systematic targeting of the innocent, of civilians, of non-combatants, for political or ideological ends. This is what defines terrorism. It's always evil. It's the nature of the act, disqualifies it. And this is what constitutes the essence of war crimes. The deliberate targeting, not of combatants, but of civilians, is the essence of war crimes. And terrorism is therefore a war crime. It's always a war crime. So there are no good terrorists and no bad terrorists. There are only bad terrorists. Palestinians here, or Islamists on the streets of Paris, equally guilty. That's very important to have that moral clarity. That's the underpinning of the battle against terrorism. Second, this terrorism is being used increasingly by militant Islam. It's not all of Islam, and many Muslims, mostly Muslims are its, numerically have been the majority of its victims, but it is militant Islam of its two branches, the militant Shiites led by Iran and the militant Sunnis led by Daesh that are fomenting this carnage, both in the Middle East and in Africa and on the streets of Europe. The enemy is militant Islam. Its method, so far, is terrorism. It is in the business of acquiring states. One already exists. It's called the Islamic State of Iran, and the second is being established. It's called the Islamic State of ISIS, Daesh. And with states, the Islamist militants can have a base from which to launch much greater and more lethal terrorism. So that's the second point. What is the method? Terrorism. Who's the propagator? Increasingly, militant Islam of both views. What is the system to fight them? One thing. Fight them. Condemn them. Identify, condemn, fight. What does that mean? I'm not going to tell you what is the mixture of air power, ground power, and other means to fight these people. I am saying that you're not going to change them. You will not win them over. You will not pacify them. The only way to defeat this is the way Nazism was defeated. First you defeat, then you denazify. That's the order. That's the priority. And it must be now a common agenda to defeat the forces of militant Islam and not to compromise with them.
So you're saying now there needs to be ground forces?
The actual decision of how you employ power is critical, but I'll leave it to discussions between governments, including the ones we'll probably have around the upcoming conference in Paris.
And what about Israel's role? I mean, what's our role in that?
We should play our role.
The Swedish foreign minister made comments Monday about the Paris attacks, implying that if there would just be a solution to the Palestinian issue, then the swamps of terror could be drained. She's not alone in that sentiment, obviously. How do you respond to that?
That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the sources of terrorism. The Middle East is disintegrating. States are disappearing. Iraq no longer exists, Syria no longer exists, Yemen no longer exists, Libya doesn't exist any longer, and so many other countries are in upheaval. That is not coming because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which is a subset, not a particularly important one, of this general upheaval. The upheaval and the source of this conflict is the battle between modernity and medievalism, early medievalism, and very violent one. That is shaking the Arab-Muslim world in a fundamental way. And these historic forces, which were bubbling underground and burst to the surface, they were contained for a century by a system of authoritarian states, first by a colonial system and then a post-colonial authoritarian state system. That is broken down, and all these forces are bursting from through the sand, through the cracks, and dislocating the Middle East and North Africa as we know them, and having a huge impact on Europe and many other lands. That's the source of the conflict. Within that, there is a battle that is ongoing for about a century between the Jewish national movement and the Palestinians who refuse to accept it. The source of that is the persistent refusal to accept a Jewish polity, Jewish sovereignty in any border. Lately, this Palestinian rejectionism is fused with militant Islam. You see that in that half the Palestinian people are now governed in Gaza by militant Islamists, Sunnis aligned with Iran, doing Iran's bidding, Islamic Jihad doing Iran's bidding. And the other half refuses to fight the first half and refuses to make its final peace or bury the hatchet with Israel. So the larger picture, modernity against medievalism. In our part of the Middle Eastern woods, the persistent refusal to accept Israel in any border. These are facts. For a long time, the larger picture was subsumed by our own conflict, and people said things that were incredibly stupid. They said that the conflict in the Middle East, the conflict always in the singular, the core of the conflict in the Middle East was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's ridiculous. It always was ridiculous, but it's particularly ridiculous today. And I'll tell you, that I think most people understand by now. I mean, there are some true believers walking around in, I don't know, certain academic circles and apparently some diplomatic circles, but they're few. And yet, it's particularly obnoxious, you know, when they accuse us, the victims, of the terrorism that is leveled against us. We're not to blame. 100 years of terrorism leveled at us with the purpose of destroying us? We're not to blame, any more than the people of Paris are to blame for the attacks that have been leveled against them, okay? So obviously we reject that. But now there's a new twist. It's not merely that we are to blame for the terrorism that is directed against us. We are to blame for the terrorism that is directed against them in Paris. Now that's a level of absurdity that is almost comic if it weren't so tragic. We reject both.
But how about the premise that our conflict adds fuel to the ability of the radical Islamists to list up?
It doesn't. I would say it's the opposite. Our presence here of a strong democratic Israel is the one of the main stopgaps against the collapse of this part of the Middle East and the flow, by the way, of an endlessly larger number of migrants into Europe. If there weren't in Israel, you would have more militant Islam, you would have nobody to fight it. Israel is, in fact, the most important and the strongest bastion against militant Islam, certainly in the Middle East, but I would say in a very, very large radius. We are not the cause, we are obstacle to militant Islam.